Welcome back, everybody. We're slowly, I think, told to start the next panel. So as you are drifting in, my name is Dagmar Soennecken from York University in Canada. We will be continuing our non-inland asylum journey by talking about refugees and other protected persons from the resettlement perspective. And that, I have James Hathaway in my head, is of course not a right, although we are dealing with very similar populations. And that's why the conversation will be from three different perspectives. We have Uganda, Canada, and Norway represented. And more precisely, we have Sophie Nakueira from the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology, who will be starting us off shortly. Then we have Erlend from the Norwegian Institute of Social Research, who will follow, and then myself, and now I'm going to get this wrong, Ritika, Tanotra from York University. And then we are delighted that Nathalie Springuel from UNHCR will be joining us to discuss. And as you can tell, we are very ambitious. We have 4 presentations and 1 discussant, and I'm the timekeeper, and Peter, who will be looking very distressed at some point, so I'll go down there to increase the looking distressed after 10 to 12 minutes. I always use humor in my teaching, so we'll see that we can keep you awake, but still talk about the challenge of vulnerability in resettlements. And Sophie will get us started.
I'm mindful of the fact that you're coming from lunch and it's Friday afternoon, so I'll be very quick. So if you have any questions, I will take them during the Q&A. So today I will be telling you about the resettlement practices and their implications for protecting the most vulnerable refugees in Africa. I say Africa knowing that it's not a country and it's a continent. And I focus on Uganda because it hosts the largest refugees on the continent and it's one of the top refugee hosting countries in the world. As of March 31st, we have over 1.5 million forcefully displaced people, and they're from surrounding areas. Uganda has a very unique humanitarian context and geographic context. Unique in the sense that it is one of the poorest countries in the world, surrounded by very many countries in conflict, and some who are in political instability, and it focuses on the most vulnerable refugees in its humanitarian assistance programs and in resettling, or at least the idea of resettling the most vulnerable people. So what does it mean to be a refugee in Uganda? It means that you're continuously going to be in a protracted refugee status, 10 to 20 years and counting, in a refugee settlement under impoverished conditions because the program is severely underfunded. So there are 3 durable solutions, of which resettlement is but one, and it's not feasible to most people. Then you would ask, why can't people just go back? I mentioned that many countries are in ongoing conflict, so voluntary repatriation is not achievable. This leaves local integration as the best solution for many people, but it is politically contentious. Only one African country, Tanzania, has so far naturalized refugees. It takes 20 years to be naturalized in Uganda, and even then, those who have spent more than 20 years still do not get naturalized. So that leaves resettlement. But we've already had that less than 1% people get resettled. And for the eligibility criteria, you have to meet the UNHCR eligibility criteria in order to be considered for resettlement. And these include legal and physical protection, people with medical needs, survivors of violence and torture, and so forth. So because of the number of high population of refugees, many of them have intersecting vulnerabilities, and they fit more than one or several of these criteria. And this creates a vulnerability competition. Just to give you an insight, the resettlement quota for Uganda for this year is 5,200 refugees. 4,000 of them will go to USA, and USA has already requested refugees from DRC. The rest might go to Canada, Norway, and Sweden. I say might because they're the only countries that have expressed interest. Absolutely no EU country has come forward to say that they want to participate. There are also some complementary pathways, but those are not very accessible for refugees because the criteria is very high. And even then, it's, I think, only Sweden, Finland and France that take some of them. So what are the selection practices? The first screening uses UNHCR eligibility criteria, which focuses on protection needs. But the actual selection focuses on the interests of the resettlement criteria, which means people will look for refugees that have integration prospects, economic or employment prospects in the country, and treatable medical diseases. So what does it mean to have a complex medical disease? You will be rejected for resettlement. So therein lies the paradox. In order to qualify, you must be very, very vulnerable. But then if you're very, very vulnerable, you will not be selected. So what are the implications? I'll just focus on 3, but there are multiple. So resettlement as a protection tool is not effective. It's not effective because as is currently being practiced, it focuses on non-protection needs. It does not even consider protection as one of them. If it does, in case of medical diseases, they must be treatable medical conditions. And this undermines the integrity of humanitarian programs. Why? Because the few programs that focus on resilience, people don't want to take them up because they feel like, why can't I then just go for resettlement? Because I'm already eligible. Why would I want to be integrated in a very poorly resourced country? And this exacerbates refugees' vulnerabilities because very few people are selected. They think the program is corrupt, and therefore they are exploited by middlemen and brokers who promise to give them resettlement slots. That picture was taken in the camp I do my fieldwork in. And during that time, they used to post the names of refugees, and people would actually get in trouble for this. Many people, if your names were put there, people who are jealous of you sometimes would poison you. I was shown some graves of people who were supposed to get resettled, and they never made it out because their neighbors knew. But now UNHCR has changed its practices, and now they will call them. But that creates another anxiety. People wait endlessly for these phone calls, and yeah. So recommendations. You'll be happy to know that this is my last slide. So I would focus on contextually appropriate and well-funded programs in the long run. In the long run, why? We already know there is no political interest in resettling many people. So how about introducing programs that are contextually appropriate for the country? This would maybe lessen the number of people that want to leave because the conditions are not bearable in the settlement. If you are going to continue resettlement, we need more protection-based resettlement because currently there's a tension between resettlement as a protection tool and the use of it as a migration control tool. And migration control, I say migration control because it looks like they're using it to weed out or to stop the mobility of undesirable populations. I would also advise that they reform the criteria for complementary pathways because right now, even though the EU countries and other development countries promise to increase resettlement slots, they did not do that. They've only done it through complementary pathways, and they knew that if they set the criteria very high, very few people would actually make it. For example, in Malawi, they were given 100 or 200 slots for education, and only 20 people could go, or 24. And that's because many of these people have been in protracted situations. They've come from war. If you have a cutoff age that is very low, many of them have missed years of education. They are very traumatized. It's very hard to meet this criteria for education. So the last recommendation is to remember that there are people behind these policies. This is about refugee protection, not migration control. So I would advocate for not only more resettlement slots, but also to have compassion. In Africa or Uganda, we call it Ubuntu, humanity. Many people have pledged, many countries have pledged to have solidarity, but the selective practice of solidarity. We saw, for example, how they reacted when Ukrainian refugees needed help. And right now, what is happening is the externalization. And many African politicians are aware that while the EU is advocating for Africa to reform its laws, it is actually not practicing what it's preaching. This is about burden shifting and not burden sharing. Thank you.
Right. So I'm following in the same line here, talking about how much vulnerability is too much in refugee resettlement. I do think it's a protection tool, although it is a very selective protection tool. As you see from the slide, 1 out of 100, so 1%, less than 1% of the world's displaced are eligible for resettlement. But then again, like for that 1%, it means a lot. And I think from integration outcomes, there is some evidence to say that this is presumably an especially vulnerable group. So I do see it as a protection tool. The UNHCR defines it as a selection and transfer of refugees from a state in which they've sought protection to a third state that has agreed to admit them as refugees, just in case there's people in the room who are not familiar with the concept. And this ties into Hathaway's point yesterday, I think, about like the relationship between vulnerability as a kind of discretionary-based fuzzy concept and the idea of legal rights and kind of tightly regulated selection practices on the other side. So this is a relationship between resettlement, which is essentially discretionary, although there's also regulated by domestic migration law, for instance, and asylum, where states are legally barred from applying other criteria than the needs for protection. So of course, the fact that it's essentially discretionary means that integration potential is likely to play into the selection. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, I think, up to a point. It's also important to think of the long-term sustainability of these programs and the idea of public support and security considerations and a host of other concerns. But for me, the question is like, when is integration potential weighted too heavily? So where should the balance be? Like, what's the right amount of when you are considering integration potential on the one hand and vulnerability on the other? So the UNHCR is very clear. It urges resettlement states not to use integration potential because such discrimination undermines the protection and needs-based approach to resettlement. It's kind of undermining the humanitarian credentials of the program. But at the same time, they also stress the need for successful integration outcomes. So there's a tension, like right to the heart of resettlement. You know, like you need to have a kind of, and you do have an interest in successful integration outcomes. But then, like, to which extent should that ultimate objective kind of influence the initial screening and selection practices? It's an open question. So there are several tensions built into refugee resettlement, in my view, but the tension between vulnerability and integration potential, whatever that means, right? I mean, analytically, it's a very complex and complicated term. Is something that I find especially interesting. So let's look a bit closer at how the European states are doing this, and other resettlement states as well are weighting the different considerations. I'm basing the following on the report that we did at the Institute for Social Research in Norway. We looked at Norway, UK, Sweden, Australia, France, Germany, Canada, and Holland, and you see that there are different approaches to selection practices. These states vary to the extent that they use explicit integration criteria in their selection. So like whether it's part of a document, for instance. And they vary to the extent whether integration potential is considered as an individual variable or whether it's at the group level. And they vary to the extent that they send missions to the first country of asylum, because these missions, i.e., a delegation, can often use their discretionary power to kind of overrule, in a sense, the candidates that are presented by the UNHCR. Let's just move forward. So it's interesting that the states vary to the extent that they look at long-term integration outcomes. Norway does it. And then if we break down the different different stages of resettlement, then we see that long-term integration outcomes feed into selection practices in various ways. So first of all, there's a UNHCR kind of global needs. So they say like these are the groups that that need resettlement right now, national groups. Then Norway kind of designs a quota and a quota composition at the parliamentary level. There's a pre-mission questionnaire that then goes from the Norwegian authorities to the UNHCR, pre-screening, and then the mission is going, a delegation is going from Norway to do interviews with refugees and consider their eligibility. They make a decision. The refugees arrive in Norway and they're settled in Norway. So like where does integration concerns feed into these kind of various stages of resettlement? I think one is the quota composition, like the way that the Norwegian parliament is defining the refugee quota. This could be both in terms of numbers, but it could also be in terms of the nationalities selected. Oh no. Oh my God. And missions is another way, like it can affect the way that missions make their decisions. Oh, Jesus. Yes, please. And it can affect where refugees are settled. So like kind of matching the municipality where they're going with their so-called vulnerability or special needs. So all of these are kind of feedback loops in the system. So this means that resettlement, I'm finishing off in 2 minutes. So it means that, as a policy, it's essentially a humanitarian policy about helping the most vulnerable and supporting the UNHCR. But then it's also, I swear to God, it didn't look like this on the computer 10 minutes ago. It's also, so it's a humanitarian policy, so but this is balanced against the integration concerns, which is about, integration outcomes, fostering integration, and also like fine-tuning the local capacity of municipalities. To which extent can the municipalities handle, to which extent do they have the capacity to handle refugee resettlement, and also provide the services that they are legally obliged to provide. But then there's also an issue of border control, regulating immigration, ID checks, all of these kind of security concerns, all of this can be linked to integration. And there's the foreign policy concerns, where Norway is interested in not stepping on the toes of other states and also maintaining good diplomatic relations, so like not resettling from certain states. And also just safeguarding a kind of a rules-based liberal order, so supporting the UN system. So one way of doing that is to give the UNHCR as much discretionary power as possible in the selection of resettlement refugees. So all of this is kind of goes together, and in terms of vulnerability, it means that vulnerability is under pressure from these kind of conflicting policy objectives. And I think as scholars, like it's important that we keep a kind of watchful eye on the way that this humanitarian program is implemented, and that we as scholars look at the practice of things and not just like how they look like in formal documents and the resettlement handbook and in the national policy statements. Thank you very much.
Oh, he's changing it back, okay. We had a little issue with different laptops, so I promised to take up some time so the tech colleague in the back could switch to our presentation. So, excellent, there we are. So now we will travel across the Atlantic to Canada, and to do this properly, in Canada it's common to acknowledge that the research that we've carried out was carried out on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations, and for York universities that would be the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. And this is usually much longer, but in the interest of time, I just wanted to mention those nations. I will just start you off by just giving you a little bit of an introduction about Canada and why you, if you know anything about Canada, you probably know it's well known for its leadership in resettlement. So as academics, we try to take it down just a tiny notch, and then Ritika will go into our 3 recommendations, and there is a theme, as you will see, between all of the presentations. This is a slide from a UNHCR celebration in 2018, and if you think about the 1 million refugees that were resettled in Germany that were from Syria in 2015, so for the 15 years from 2003 and 2018 that was being celebrated, the United States barely was up to 1 million resettlement requests. And the US really is quantitatively the largest number, but Canada is at 156,000 for those 15 years, and Canada's annual target for immigrants generally, now just went up to 500,000. Still, those are the quantitatively largest numbers for a 15-year time frame. So in terms of this 1% that Erlend talked about and that also Sophie talked about, this is where the leaders are, but it's still a drop in the bucket. In 2019, Canada became the leader in absolute numbers because of the Trump presidency. So this is just to give you an idea of what the numbers were like, and that's hard to see for me. So 19,000, the inland part in the middle is also there because that was a fairly low year for Canada from an inland perspective. And then what Canada is also well known for is the private-sponsored refugee stream that you may be familiar with, and that is actually now larger than the government-assisted stream, and I'll talk about that in a second because that's interesting from a vulnerability perspective. We wanted to point out, because in most countries, the actors that deal with resettlement are very different actors from the inland asylum claims. So if you're interested, I can explain all of the abbreviations later, but the point is we're talking about bringing similar peoples to Canada through the inland stream and through the overseas process, but the actors are different, discretion is different, processes are different, and vulnerability criteria are also quite different. And that creates interesting tensions that we could talk about if you're interested. And then Hathaway in my head. So what does vulnerability do? What do you get if you're labeled vulnerable in the resettlement process? There are procedural accommodations, just like he talked about yesterday. The interview might be waived. This integration thing, the ability to establish, still exists in Canadian legislation. Ritika will talk about that, was taken away in the vulnerable category. So it's waived if you're considered vulnerable, special needs. There might be a faster processing time if your case is considered urgent. And the Canadian innovation is that there are some very tiny small programs, the so-called Joint Assistance Sponsorship Stream and the Blended Visa Officer Refugee Resettlement Stream, where you might get longer resettlement assistance if you have very high needs, or the government might pay for half of the fees and then the private sponsor might pay for the other half. So there's some interesting way to play with who bears the burden of integrating and accompanying you in your settlement. And there's also the possibility to switch between streams once a resettlement agency, once the person comes to Canada, recognizes the person really has much higher needs than we anticipated, they can apply to transition to a different stream. But from the quantitative bars that I showed at the beginning, it's a very, very tiny percentage. And as Sophie pointed out, there are regional quotas that also apply. And this is, again, just to give you an idea of credibility is always important, but there's such different, there's the legal obligation versus the discretionary part, and there are very different norms and ideas in these two different worlds of resettlement. And I guess in Canada in the 1990s, it was debated to perhaps have one process that was rejected, but it's still a question, I think, just to keep in mind and to think about. And now Ritika will talk about our 3 recommendations.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So in the interest of time, we are focusing our presentation on 3 specific key findings and recommendations. So the first one is focused on looking at the relationship between integration and vulnerability. The second one is focused on looking at a multifaceted approach when it comes to vulnerability, and you'll see some connections with the Italian team who talked about trafficking this morning, as well as the other Canadian team presentation on inland asylum claims. And we will end off with a discussion and recommendation where we advocate for more of a global rather than regional approach when it comes to selecting refugees from overseas. So firstly, as already mentioned, most resettlement states do balance future integration potential when it comes to selecting refugees overseas for resettlement. So Canada is one of those countries. However, while it is still in Canada's legislation, since 2001, with the enactment of the Immigration Refugee Protection Act, so what is called IRPA, Canadian visa officers overseas can actually waive this criteria if the applicant or the refugee that Canada is looking to select is deemed as vulnerable. And so the question of who is vulnerable will also come into play, which I'll talk about in a second when I discuss the second key finding. And so here with the kind of waiving, this idea of law in the books versus law in action. So the law in the book states that integration potential is to be taken into account. However, with law in the action, you can see that visa officers have the discretion to waive this criteria. We can see this as one example in the ways in which Canada is willing to kind of experiment things when it comes to waiving certain criteria if someone is deemed as vulnerable, and is an example of them essentially committing to uphold their humanitarian commitment when it comes to assisting those who are seen as vulnerable. So one interesting trend that we've noted between government-sponsored and privately sponsored refugees specifically is that government-sponsored refugees, visa officers have to use the UNHCR vulnerability criteria. The same does not apply, as Dagmar mentioned, when it comes to privately sponsored refugees. That is left up to the sponsors, and that can happen either before or after arrival to Canada. PSR, so privately sponsored refugees, in comparison to government-assisted refugees, when they arrive in Canada, research has shown that they do have better integration outcomes because they do arrive with some sort of connections, whether that's family or friends. Unfortunately, we cannot kind of dive into the differences when it comes to integration and some of the challenges and criticisms of privately sponsored refugees in Canada, but we're happy to point you to that research if you are interested. And I realized I did not switch the slide. Okay, so I'll get to the recommendation in a second, but first what I want to show you is a quote. So I'm not going to read the quote, but we've highlighted kind of the main idea. But to summarize the quote, essentially one of our participants, what they have said is that when we think of integration, we usually think of it from a economic integration potential. So you come to Canada, you find a job, and that you're integrated. But the reality is that integration for refugees can mean, is it buzzing? Okay. Integration can actually mean so many different things. So when we spoke with migrants, and this is highlighted in the quote, for some refugees, integration is actually learning the language, so learning how to speak English. For others, it's making connections within the community. So by saying that integration specifically means economic integration and you finding a job, that can be considered as problematic. So what do we recommend? We recommend that Canada should continue to ensure and uphold its international commitment to protect refugees for resettlement, and it should continue in practice to waive the integration criteria, which many visa officers do, if an individual is deemed as vulnerable. However, we also advocate that the vulnerability screening should not be limited to just government-sponsored refugees, but it should also apply to other categories, so privately sponsored refugees as well. The second focus is looking at vulnerability from a multifaceted approach. And like I mentioned before, this is going to relate to what was discussed in the morning with the Italian team, but often when we think of vulnerability, we think of it through this gendered lens. So women, children, and the elderly. And usually those three groups are prioritized. However, after speaking with, and I want to show you the quote first. One of our participants highlighted the fact that when we think of vulnerability, we're using a gendered approach. And so Canada does do this too in practice. We have the Women at Risk program, for example. So UNHCR as well will use kind of a gendered approach. However, how do I go back? Okay. Essentially what I want to say is that the interview highlighted the fact that in Syria, for example, there were a lot of men who were left behind because there's this idea that they could not possibly be victims of sexual violence, but the reality is that in some cases they were actually much more vulnerable. So oftentimes we've heard every refugee is vulnerable, but some are more vulnerable than others. In reality and in practice, what does that mean? And we see that there is this gendered kind of approach being highlighted, and Canada does this as well, prioritizing women, the elderly, and children. When it comes to certain men who have been victims of sexual violence, the reality is that in some cases they're actually more at risk and more vulnerable than, in some cases, other women who may not have experienced sexual violence. So that was one of the key things that one participant highlighted, the fact that when we think of men, we don't see them as necessarily vulnerable to the same extent as women. So this is a particular group that is often left behind. So the question is raised that if every refugee is vulnerable and some are more vulnerable than others, then what does that look like in practice? And there's obviously differences with how it looks like in practice. And when we asked some of our interviews of this, they each had kind of something different to say. So you can kind of see that everyone's idea of more vulnerable is very different. And so our recommendation is that Canada take a multifaceted approach when it comes to vulnerability. And what we mean by that is considering the role of gender, race, class, sexuality, religion, and all of that when it comes to looking at who is vulnerable, because oftentimes it is men who are left behind. And there is some really great work that has been done by Simon Turner, for example, that looks at the relationship between vulnerability and men. There's also work that has been done on looking at deservingness and who is deserving and worthy of protection and what that image looks like on a humanitarian level. And if anyone wants to be pointed to some literature, I'm more than happy to do that. And finally, we advocate for a global approach to vulnerability. So what does a global approach look like? Canada, and I'm glad Sophie brought this up, because if you compare the Afghani and Ukrainian response in Canada, for example, I'll speak to that a little bit. So when we look at the Syrian refugee resettlement movement in Canada, that's often highlighted. That's a specific regional approach where we had a particular community that we were looking at to resettle from overseas. If you look at the Afghan response, one of the criticisms has been that in certain what we call emergencies, so in cases where you need immediate action being taken with the Afghanis because they're going through the regular resettlement stream, it's actually been a little more challenging in making sure that Canada is able to match its quota. So it promised to resettle about 40,000 Afghan refugees, but since August 2021, they have not yet met their target. But they are keen to meet that target by the end of this year. And the numbers have certainly increased, but if you compare that to the Ukrainian response with the creation of a temporary program with the Ukrainian, what we call emergency, that was the creation of the Canada-Ukraine authorization for emergency travel, where Ukrainians can come to Canada for 3 years, work, study, and live. So it's a temporary program, but you can already see that over 160,000 Ukrainians since the start of the war, so since February 2022, the numbers are definitely much more different. So we kind of push for this need to take a more global approach. So we're not focusing on one specific region, but that there are refugees from across the world that need assistance. And so that can mean changing the way we approach particular emergencies where immediate action is required. In some cases with the Afghanis, because they're going through the regular resettlement stream, some of them might not have documentation. The process is very slow, and so it takes a very long time for them to come here. And so, to conclude, we advocate for a push to take an approach that considers this idea that yes, all refugees are vulnerable, but we need to make sure that we're looking at refugees from across the world rather than focusing on one specific region. And so to conclude, what we wanted to highlight from the Canadian side is that while Canada is doing a lot to uphold its humanitarian commitment, there is more that it can do to ensure that it's helping those who are most vulnerable. Thank you.
Nathalie, would you like to come up, or are you going to stay? You're going to stay over there. Okay, excellent. Good.
Thank you. Thank you. Does it work? Yeah. Okay. You can hear me. Yeah? Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for the presentation. It's really a pleasure to take part in this panel and to have the opportunity to reflect on your study and paper that I had the opportunity to read. As well as to hear the findings here. In the discussion today, the panelists have mentioned, of course, the concept of vulnerability in the context, in particular context of resettlement. I'm going to draw a few points that I take from the presentation or from your work. Professor Soennecken and Tanotra's work has highlighted the vulnerability in the context of a Canadian process. You also focus also on the diverging interpretation and not standards, but I mean interpretation, yeah, by case workers when they're processing cases. The challenges also around additional criteria, integration potential criteria used by some states. You mentioned also the name sponsorship program in Canada, which has been successful. Dr. Nakueira, sorry, you shared a very interesting findings also in Uganda and through participatory method, refugee. It's very interesting for UNHCR to have those findings and the difficult reality, of course, in receiving, the difficult situation refugees are facing in the host country, but also, principally because also of the lack of durable solution and not only resettlement, yeah? The delays also in the processing, the limited quotas, the increased need for transparency and feedback to people. You show a very, very good slide there of a practice that fortunately has ended. It was a long time ago, but the misunderstanding also of refugee community in the field and on what is resettlement, what are the criteria, the risk of exploitation, which is key, I think, and the increased need, the need for increased information sharing. That's really key for us and for refugees to receive feedback, as well as for us also to receive feedback from refugees on information, if the information is reaching them. Dr. Paasche, also very interesting presentation. You mentioned few quotes that I took, but you mentioned the challenges of assessing vulnerability in the context, of course, of the resettlement process, but also focusing more here on the additional criteria. It was very interesting discussion also in your paper on family size, on reception capacity as well of municipalities in the context of Norway, that I'll come back to that and comment on this. Also mentioned the name sponsorship program. So it brings a lot of important information to us. I would like to bring my perspective as well, UNHCR perspective, and because what the panelists have basically done is bring different angles from the resettlement countries, from the field, and as well from another resettlement countries, pointing also at UNHCR work. So let me try to add a few points in the UNHCR perspective. To identify the needs of refugees, we work basically with two main tools. One is what we call the projected global resettlement needs that is issued on a yearly basis, and that is a whole process. I have the document here, I'll show it to you because it's a very important key tool. But this is really the basis for us. Basically it's how to prioritize the different regions and different groups of refugees to make sure that we ensure a consistent a consistent approach to resettlement with different actors, with resettlement countries and others. The PGRN, as we call, maps the different regional situation and identify the priority situation. So for instance, today in 2023, UNHCR and partners also have identified 5 priority areas, which are a priority situation, which are Afghanistan, Syria, the Syrians, the Central Mediterranean, the Rohingyas, and Venezuela. So this is the 5 priority areas where we ask states to concentrate in the large quota, those who have large quota, to really concentrate on such population. This being said, other cases can also be considered for resettlement under an allocated quota, so that's a different thing. So that's one important tool. And the second aspect, the second tool aspect I wanted to focus on is the individual identification of individual cases. So here, and especially in the context of Uganda, what is important for us to try to look at, on UNHCR front, is it's not, vulnerability is not a static concept. It's a vulnerability assessment. So this is very important. It's an assessment. And against what are we assessing? We are looking basically at different aspects. One is on a case-by-case basis, we're looking at the profile we have in front of us. And so the individual, the refugee, and his family. And on the other side, we have always to evaluate against a protection environment. And protection environment, so UNHCR is conducting every year a review of the protection environment, part of our strategy, part of protection strategy, part of our solution strategy. It is essential to do that exercise. We review legislation, states practice, jurisprudence, and other issues. And then we do an evaluation on a case-by-case basis. For UNHCR, it is essential that states do follow the PGRN document, and also that they do follow as well the 7 submission categories that you have mentioned that are applicable are recommended in the resettlement process. Now I'm hearing that I'll go quickly. One important point that you mentioned is the additional state criteria, and I would like to continue with that. What we have heard is, like, for instance, family size may be additional criteria. So as you mentioned with your graph, it happens during the discussion on the quota. Some states do request not to have too large family, but this is more for practical reason. Some states, for instance, are initiating resettlement, are new resettlement states. They have a problem with reception, they have a problem with accommodation. So some states do request and do agree with UNHCR, but some other states don't. And that's we have to mention. The US, you don't have a limitation of family size, for instance. So normally states are also asking not to have only women at risk, or only this case. They ask for a balanced approach. So it's reasonable, I would say. So that's the way we look at it. The reception, the municipality criteria as well. It's a question more of practical question of capacity. This criteria, this additional selection criteria, if I may say, are reviewed on a yearly basis and they change. So now, on the integration potential criteria, on that UNHCR has called states not to use integration potential and other selection criteria, such as, for instance, ethnicity or religion. We do ask not to use that, and we ask states to focus on a need-based approach. Let me finish with pointing at the last aspects, which is the vulnerability of refugees in the host country, and particularly the case of Uganda is of interest. You show the many risks and the many, the situation of refugees in Uganda. On our side, as UNHCR, it's part of our work and part of our responsibility to establish a strong communication strategy. which is shared and which is part of the solution and protection strategy and done on a yearly basis. So indeed, refugees need to have timely access to information on the decision. We have to share information against fraud, for instance. The fraud mechanism, we have in each operation, it is standards in different locations. We have complaint mechanism, complaint box, people can reach us by email and so on. So it is important to ensure adequate information, but it's also important for us to receive feedback from refugees if it does not reach them, to adjust then our strategy, communication strategy. And a quick note, I think I have exhausted my time, but a quick last note is to conclude. I mean, what is behind the whole problem? What we all agree is that resettlement places are not enough. And we, in our advocacy, all states, UNHCR has requested for more resettlement places, but also for more countries to engage in resettlement program. This is a major problem. So UNHCR recently attended a resettlement forum at the EU level and called for more states to be engaged, which is one of the key priority at our level. Last sentence, resettlement remains a very important protection tool, and we should really consider, and encourage states to continue to use it. It's a life-saving mechanism. Thank you very much. Sorry for...
I was told I can collect a question or maybe two, and then we can discuss over coffee so we don't delay. Is there a question that you'd like to pose to anybody, and then we shall talk over coffee? There's a careful finger hand over there. Go ahead, there was a Peter right there. Didn't you have your finger up? No? It looked like a question. Oh, okay, misunderstanding. Last call for questions to be discussed over coffee. Oh, excellent.
I know that I asked multiple questions, sorry for that. So Canada, in fact, is one of the major receiving countries for resettlement from Turkey. And especially for queer refugees, is essential way of protection. However, especially after the Syrian civil war, the delays became up to 10 years for waiting process, with a very limited access to labor market and even for healthcare and hormonal treatments for transgender refugees and so on. So during this very long waiting period that takes 4 years, is it possible at least to address certain vital issues or to improve the situation for those? So I'm in fact looking at the UNHCR here, of course, but if you have any idea about this situation, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question, and we shall discuss over whenever the next break is, because that we were told, or maybe if there's a hot, quick response, then are we allowed a hot, quick response? Okay, yes, excellent. I'll pass it, Nathalie, I'll pass it to you.
I'll be very happy also to discuss over a coffee break further, but when you mentioned 10 years, that's in the asylum procedure, I guess, huh? So, yeah. Not in the resettlement process. Normally our standard procedure is 1 year maximum, including departure. So, having been in Turkey in my last posting, I know a bit the situation. Indeed, the delays to receive a decision are quite long, but the influx was major. We had 3.5 million people entering the country in a very short time. And for Syrians, for instance, that was one of the measures that was adopted by the government, a very positive development on the temporary protection decree that was issued to ensure that they have access to various services. Other nationalities different. Afghans, Iranian, and that's quite a large group of beneficiaries, so they have to apply for what they call conditional refugee status. and are being processed now by the government. In the past was processed under UNHCR mandate, and now it has been handed over since 2019 to the DGMM, the Department of Migration Management in Turkey. So indeed the process are long, but 3.5 million people without a pragmatic solution, such as in the context of Ukraine or in Ukrainian and the TPD, or in the context of Turkey with the temporary protection, it's not feasible. I mean, of course, it impacts the delays for all nationalities. I'll stop here, but happy to continue to discuss.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, and we look forward to discussing further.